370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, P.O. Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. We've got a fast-paced news bonanza for you today. We'll be talking the PM's energy endgame even, war crimes in Ukraine and the implications for the Chinese Communist Party of Shanghai's never-ending lockdown. All that to come, but first, here are the latest GB News headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 12 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. The man who killed Sabina Nessa has been sentenced to life in prison. He must serve at least 36 years behind bars, and he pled guilty to her murder. Kochi Selimaj from Eastbourne killed the schoolteacher in a park in south-east London last September as she walked to meet up with friends. Now, during the sentencing, the judge said it was very cowardly of Selimaj to refuse to attend his sentencing, but said he had no power to force him. Senior Investigating Officer DCI Neil John says Selimaj was caught before he could attack another victim.
I've described him previously as an evil coward. I maintain that. As a human being, I'm appalled by the level of violence that he inflicted on Sabina. And I think as a police officer, I'm relieved that the team have been able to track, trace, apprehend and prosecute him in a timely manner.
Britain has sanctioned more individuals, including the adult daughters of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The United States also placed restrictions on them earlier this week. Britain's also sanctioned the children of Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. The Foreign Office says more than £275 billion of Russian money has now been frozen by coordinated UK and international sanctions. Ukrainian officials say 39 people have been killed and over 100 have been wounded in a Russian rocket strike on a railway station in East Ukraine. 2 rockets struck the station in the city of Kramatorsk, which was busy at the time with women, children and elderly evacuees. President Zelensky says Russian forces are cynically destroying the civilian population. The Kremlin has denied any involvement in the attack. Russian forces have fully withdrawn from the north of Ukraine back into Belarus and Russia. That's the latest intelligence from the UK Ministry of Defence, and their assessment is that some of those soldiers, though, will be likely to be moved now to fight in the Donbas region. The intelligence says Russian forces are still shelling cities in the east and the south of Ukraine, and they're making further advances. Now, as of Tuesday this week, 12,000 Ukrainians had arrived in the UK. The Home Office says almost 11,000 came under the Ukraine Family Scheme and over 1,000 came through the Homes for Ukraine sponsorship. Almost 80,000 applications have been received by the Home Office from Ukrainians wanting to come here. So far, 41,000 visas have been granted. At least 2 people have been arrested after climate activists staged a protest on Tower Bridge. 2 Extinction Rebellion members were seen hanging from the bridge by suspension cords. They'd unfurled a banner that reads, "End fossil fuels now." Police had closed surrounding roads while the incident is ongoing. P&O Ferries has said its services will be suspended this weekend following the controversial sacking of 800 employees. In a statement that they posted on social media, the operator said services would not run, including between Dover and Calais. They've told customers who have tickets to seek alternative routes. Boris Johnson has failed to rule out another lockdown should a new coronavirus variant appear. Currently, hospital admissions in England due to coronavirus have reached their highest level since January 2021. Well, speaking to GB News, the Prime Minister said he wouldn't take any options off the table in tackling the virus.
I can't rule out something, Esther. I can't, say that we wouldn't be forced to do non-pharmaceutical interventions again of the kind that we did. I think it would be irresponsible of any leader, in any democracy, to say that they're going to rule out something that could save life.
Boris Johnson was speaking with the Conservative MPs Esther McVeigh and Philip Davies. You can watch the full interview tomorrow on GB News on the Saturday selection at 10 a.m. Let's look at a bit more travel now. And airports and airlines have been criticised by the Civil Aviation Authority for failing to recruit enough staff to meet the recent demand for passenger travel. The body's chief executive has condemned disruption experienced by passengers trying to get away over the Easter break. He says late notice cancellations and excessive delays are distressing for customers and they have the potential to impact confidence levels across the industry. Well, today, Manchester Airport has asked passengers to prepare for long queues and arrive 3 hours before their flight to avoid missing it. You're up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's return to the briefing with Tom.
Coming up this hour on The Briefing, with the Prime Minister announcing a new dawn for nuclear energy, we'll be discussing the government's energy policy and how that could minimise our reliance on foreign energy sources. And with the French election much closer than expected, we head to Paris for the latest. Can Marine Le Pen pull out a massive shock, and what would be the implications? And as China continues its zero COVID policy, we speak to an expert on whether China should learn to live with COVID like the rest of the world. And of course, give me your political briefing on all of the above issues. Send in your views and opinions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. Now, yesterday, the government finally unveiled its long-awaited energy security strategy amid the energy market being squeezed in Europe. Central to the plans is the government's hope to bring about a third era of nuclear energy, moving from our anemic pace of building just one reactor a decade up to one every single year. Well, to talk through the implications of this, I'm joined by Rear Admiral Michael Hewitt, the CEO of IP3 Security. IP3 Security helps to bring safe and secure nuclear power to the international market. Rear Admiral Hewitt has recently contributed to a report on the UK's energy security with former Defence Secretary Liam Fox. Michael, welcome to the programme. This has been a long time coming. Whilst the review took over a month to be published and the strategy is finally in our hands, the government had been signalling that it wanted to expand nuclear energy since the summer. Is it exactly what we expected?
I think in some ways it is, and if you look at the 10-point plan, the energy white paper, and the RAB model, and the Prime Minister's support to net zero at COP26, you could see this coming, because up until this point, energy was being defined by climate policy and not energy security. So with a kind of fresh view on the energy mix here in the UK, obviously being driven a lot by what we're seeing happen in Ukraine, nuclear power rose to the fore. We're not surprised by that at all. It contributes to decarbonization, but moreover, it contributes to the UK having its own indigenous energy source, which is a premium now. So I like the idea that we're talking about energy, not from climate policy, but from national security.
And of course, with nuclear power, there's the added bonus that it is a low carbon or zero carbon, however you want to phrase it. It's not a hydrocarbon source of energy. It is, however, quite expensive and does take quite some time to get up and running, a lead-in time of over 10 years to create a new nuclear power station. Is there a worry that this strategy is not going to do anything for anyone in the short term?
I think the strategy, unfortunately, has something for everyone, which usually means it has something for no one. In this particular case, continuing to rely heavily on renewable energy, particularly wind, which we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years, has really created the energy crisis that you have in the UK today. And to blame the Russian invasion of Ukraine for the energy crisis is very short-sighted. So we have to really focus in on bringing affordable nuclear power, which can be done. We did it in the 70s. Rolls-Royce in particular, who builds for your UK Navy, has an SMR program that we think can get to market.
Small modular reactors.
Correct. The small modular reactors, which actually complement renewable energy much better. The large construction projects of Hinkley Point and others really have run their course. We're not doing them except for one location in the United States. Really, Russia and China dominate that industry now. So we have to go back to focusing on what kind of nuclear power fits for the UK model. And we think a UK-built, UK-branded company such as Rolls-Royce, complementing the renewable energy and a commitment to fossil fuel. I think what we've all realized is that getting out of fossil fuel as a way to push towards renewable energy doesn't work. So I really like the fact that we're going back to oil and gas. I think we should be doing more in fracking here in the UK. But the point is, you need to have your own source of energy so that you can control the outcome of your prices and actually the jobs in the manufacturing that need to come along with it.
Boris Johnson likes to say that the United Kingdom is the Saudi Arabia of wind, of offshore wind, I should say. The strategy doesn't have that much to say about new onshore wind, but it looks like we will be building more offshore wind. Certainly, it's much of a cheaper technology than it used to be. It does provide good energy, but it's intermittent. And so the big problem there is, how do you have the baseload power? How do you either have storage or make sure that you can have a free flow of energy when the wind isn't blowing? And while we won't have new nuclear for some time, how do we fill that gap?
Well, I think you fill the gap with gas. You go back to recognizing that fossil fuels are part of a transition plan. And the capacity factor issue with renewable energy, which operates around 30 to 35%, which means 65% of that capacity is unused. And so recognizing that going to 50 gigawatts of wind really doesn't mean you get 50 gigawatts of baseload. It's just the opposite. But with nuclear power, for every gigawatt you build, that is an actual gigawatt of always-on, emissions-free power. And then on top of that, it's the kind of electricity that new industries are looking for, because it's not intermittent. Big data industries, oil refineries, hydrogen production, they like clean power. Anything that you do these days better say green, but it better be baseload power to produce that kind of application. So I think we are continuing to overcommit to renewable energy, recognizing that that is the source of much of your problems today. If you go back to 2020 and you look at some of the energy shortages you had, it was really driven by the fact that the wind wasn't blowing sufficiently. Sometimes the wind blows too much. So I think you have to balance the renewables with the baseload, and nuclear is your baseload balance.
The strategy does have something to say about hydrogen. And there are different types of hydrogen. There's dirty hydrogen, there's green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is when you use those renewable energy sources to then convert the energy they make into hydrogen and then use that. But that's pretty inefficient. It loses about 50% of the energy that you collected in the first place. What are your thoughts on leaning into hydrogen as that sort of storage capacity?
Well, I think if the Prime Minister thinks that wind is going to be the Saudi Arabian equivalent for the UK, you have to be able to distribute that energy. Hydrogen becomes that source of energy that you can produce with green sources of power, such as wind, and then be able to distribute it to the applications and export it. The problem is with renewable energy as the source of power, it's very inefficient for producing the hydrogen, so the cost is way higher. But again, with a nuclear power plant, because it's always on, I can match it up to the application, drive down the cost of producing that hydrogen, and it still is green hydrogen. Any other form of hydrogen that's not green is really not effective to the decarbonization plans of the country.
Well, it's probably counterproductive, because not only are you not putting in green energy to make that hydrogen, but you're losing a lot of that energy along the way, the sort of waste that's created there. Again, all of this conversation seems to be looking at what's going to be happening in the next decade. It would have been very, very sensible for governments to bring forward a British energy security strategy 10 or 20 years ago, but we are where we are. I suppose to some extent, politicians might not be thanked for this, even if it helped us in a decade's time.
Well, I think you look at what Tony Blair did when he really took a very smart and sound energy strategy with nuclear power, fossil fuels, and renewables coming in as an augment to the baseload. And unfortunately, it flipped around, and renewables became the sole focus for decarbonization. And we realize that's put us in the predicament that we're in, not just here in the UK, but throughout Europe. And so I think it's really smart, and it's time to make a very hard decision, which is to commit back to more carbon-based fuel as a transition plan, but make nuclear power. And I like the idea of 25% of the power generated in the UK coming from nuclear, because that'll generate over 60% of your clean power. So because of the comparison. So I like this plan. It is a bold plan. I think we need to really pay close attention to an overcommitment to renewable energy and go back to the energy security as the key aspect.
Just finally in this conversation, how realistic is it that we're going to have a greater sense of energy security, that more of this is going to be coming domestically? Of course, we do import power through interconnectors to the continent. We do import gas, mainly from Qatar and the US. How realistic is it that we'll enter a new realm of somewhat self-sufficiency?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that you're never going to be 100% sourced for your energy. We're too entangled in energy. Energy really operates across borders, and you want to have diversity and globalization in your energy. But you also need to be able to ensure that your ratepayers and your consumers have safe, reliable energy that invites in new jobs and new industries and new investment. And I think one of the aspects of this plan is inviting in the private sector to commercialize this. And with nuclear power, we firmly believe these are investable assets, particularly when you tie it to climate change. So I'm very excited about that aspect of the program.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion. It's something that's completely risen up the political salience ladder as people are really feeling the pinch in their pockets. Thank you so much for talking us through those really important issues on the briefing for us there. Michael Hewitt, of course, of IP3 security, which of course helps to bring safe nuclear power to the international market. Well, moving on now. On Sunday, France will head to the polls to vote in the first round of presidential elections. If no one wins a majority of the vote, the top two candidates will face a head-to-head runoff at the end of this month. Voters will have the opportunity to stick with the current president, Emmanuel Macron, or change course for a number of more radical leaders. Most likely to reach the second round to face Macron is the candidate of the National Rally, formerly the National Front, Marine Le Pen. She's been climbing in the polls in recent weeks after spending years trying to tone down her far-right image. Well, today, in efforts to counter this, Macron spoke to French conservative newspaper Le Figaro today, where he praised his predecessor Nicolas Sarkozy for his work on protecting borders, reforming the Schengen area, and taking down illegal immigration networks. Well, joining me to discuss the dynamics of this race is the Paris columnist for The Telegraph, Anne-Elizabeth Moutet. Welcome to the programme. It is remarkable to see Le Pen climb up in those polls. She had been nipping and tucking with a more radical candidate, Zemmour, until recently. How has Ukraine changed the face of this race?
I should say Ukraine absolutely killed off the dynamic of Eric Zemmour, because Zemmour appeared to be so much more radical and so much more tin-ear than Marine Le Pen on this, that he stopped being in tune with at least a good, a third of public opinion, very strongly. His first reaction was to say that France had no vocation to take in Ukrainian refugees, and then he sort of waited very long to react to Ukraine and to deny that he had said, he couldn't deny it, but to try to walk back declarations he'd made over the years that Putin was a great Russian patriot and that France needed her own Vladimir Putin. This may have been 5 years ago, but it harmed him. It's not very good for him.
It's interesting because whilst Zemmour might have been more recently aligned with Putin, Marine Le Pen herself has had a bit of a problem in this area. Just at the start of last month, she pulped 1.2 million pamphlets that were printed that had a pretty prominent picture of her shaking the hand of Mr. Putin on them. But her rhetoric has steered away from Ukraine, focusing more on the cost of living. I suppose that's helped in the short term, but it is still a bit of an Achilles heel.
It is. It ought to be. All three extreme candidates, Éric Zemmour, Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen, have form in defending Russia. And this is usually due to something that's very structural to French society, which is sort of reflexing anti-Americanism, which is both ideological and something that sort of comes too naturally to the French. In the case of Marine Le Pen, what she did, first of all, she was much more reactive than Éric Zemmour. She realized that Ukraine was something dangerous. She said quickly that it was an invasion and that nothing warranted an invasion. And then she very sort of prudently said nothing at all. And then when the question of refugees came up, she said, of course, we will take refugees, pointing out these are the kind of refugees we want, quote unquote. That was something. The other thing is that I think she actually understood better the mood of the country. One of the things about Eric Zemmour is he's very good at old-fashioned politics, which is tasting the sort of what a crowd will expect. But he is not a digital native. Actually, he's not digital at all. He finds it difficult even to organize a Zoom. And the result is that he had no clue what happened worldwide in terms of emotion, surprise, and circulation of information about Ukraine. And I think that's really, these are two things, two failings that he showed. One being that he knows nothing about foreign policy. He doesn't speak English. He doesn't speak any other language. He only reads obsessively in French. And the second was that. Meanwhile, he has helped Marine Le Pen immensely because now she looks much more mild. She looks easy to deal with. She is a 53-year-old woman who is an avowed cat lady. She is much less abrasive, and she could have dreamt him up. Even in that period when he was gaining votes and personalities from her party, actually he has helped her because now she looks quite respectable.
Which is remarkable given the history of her party and its links with all sorts of very nefarious ideas and indeed people. Looking at the National Rally, as it's now called, back in 2018, the Front National changed its name to National Rally. Do people think this is a party that has changed? Because, of course, a lot of the faces are still the same.
Well, the one face that created the National Front in the 70s is entirely different, and that's Marine Le Pen's own father, the 93-year-old Jean-Marie Le Pen. And he was a bit of a monster in all directions, including as a parent, and she finally fired him 10 years ago when he made one anti-Semitic joke too many. And she, quite honestly, she's not concerned with all the obsessions of the old-fashioned French extreme right. She has been called by her own members. She's been said to be surrounded by a gay mafia. She is not a social conservative, and actually all her social platform in terms of benefits and stuff like that is quite frankly nationalistic, in that she feels that the French ought to have a better social network than immigrants. But apart from that, she has a very almost socialist point of view of sort of keeping pensions and benefits and various aids to the economy, to small businesses, and to people who've been through the mill in much comprehensive ways. So she comes across as someone who got rid of her father, changed the name of the party, avowedly wanted to detoxify the party. She did fire some people who were too aggressive. She certainly refuses any kind of racist or anti-Semitic rhetoric. And she comes across, even though her platform actually is still quite hard, she comes across as somebody who has changed. It took her 3 presidential runs, but this is where she's at, which is why she's within distance of getting, certainly she probably will be in the second round, and she's now in the margin of error of the latest polls, partly because of Emmanuel Macron's weakness to get possibly the presidency. I'd say about 20%. The bookies say 17%.
It is remarkable looking at the age profile of those that seem to be backing Ms. Le Pen. It seems to be younger people rather than older people, potentially people who feel locked out of the economic system. As you mentioned, her economic programme is really quite left-wing and nationalistic, anti-trade, anti-market, pro-state. And of course, herself has taken a number of loans from Russian banks in recent years. Some really quite worrying aspects of this party. I suppose if you are a centre-right voter in France, you're probably better off going with Mr. Macron, aren't you?
Many people are going to go for Emmanuel Macron, and strangely enough, I have met Zemmour voters who say, no, I'd rather vote for Macron because she is the past, and also they're very much afraid that if she doesn't get too many votes, the danger is that Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the hard left candidate, will be in the race. And it's more widespread than you'd think. Strangely enough, too, because this is really a fascinating election. It looks from abroad, it looks like the same election as 5 years ago, but it's entirely different. And the one candidate who's got most young people is actually Éric Zemmour. Éric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen actually are completely complementary, but they can't stand one another. He has more men, 61%. He has voters in more educated and more urban categories in the southeast of France. She has more women, 55%. She has voters in the Rust Belt in the north and northeast, but also in any small town and deserted area of France where there are no public services, and where if the single company that operated in your city disappears, you have no jobs. Her voters are much more like Trump voters or some of the northern Brexit voters, and the two of them represent a sort of move of the general French mood to the right. And the one extreme left candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's taken all the space from all the other left-wing candidates who practically do not exist anymore, is, apart from the immigration questions and apart from some aspects of domestic policy, he is working on the same tropes as these two candidates. It's a weird election.
A remarkable election, and one that kicks off this Sunday. Of course, then the second round several weeks later. We'll be following it with great interest here on GB News. But for now, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, the Paris columnist of The Telegraph, thanks so much for joining us to talk through those issues. Coming up, we'll talk to the top pollster, Joe Twyman, and discuss the Chancellor's ratings in the polls. But before that, a short break.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, P&O Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Welcome back. Now, Chancellor Rishi Sunak's popularity with voters has plunged amid a continuing debate over the government's reaction to surging living costs and a number of personal scandals. Well, that's according to a new poll. The Chancellor's net favourability was down 24 points since just before his spring statement on the 23rd of March to reach minus 29. A survey by pollsters YouGov has found, that is. The poll moves the Chancellor's support down below that of Sir Keir Starmer, who sits at minus 25. Now, this is the first time that a Tory Chancellor has ever polled below Sir Keir Starmer. Well, joining me in the studio to discuss this is the co-founder and director of Delta Poll, Joe Twyman. Well, welcome to the programme. First of all, Rishi Sunak seemed like he was floating above all of politics for quite some time during the pandemic. Now it seems to have flipped completely around.
Well, that's right, but I think it would have taken a very brave person, shall we say, to think that his rating 2 years ago, where more than 60% of people were saying that he was doing a good job, would have taken a brave person to think that that would continue. At that time, really all anyone in the general public knew about Rishi Sunak was that he was handing out a lot of money, whether it was furloughs or Eat Out to Help Out, a series of initiatives. Now, handing out money generally tends to be popular, but if that's all you know about someone, it's inevitable that further down the line, when more information becomes available, that's going to take a hit for him. And so we've recently had the cost of living crisis, the spring statement, which was not particularly well received, and these most recent revelations about his wife, all of which have, if you like, added to the information that people have about him. They can make a fuller judgment, and that judgment, increasingly, is not positive.
Are the people of Britain that fickle? That when we see politicians handing out money, we don't expect that will have to be paid for at some point in time? Is it really just a sort of snapshot by snapshot assessment? Do people not think things through further forward, as we might assume?
Well, in the artificial construction of a survey instrument, when I'm asking a member of the public what they think of someone, they're forming an opinion based on the information that they have. And the information, as I say, 2 years ago was very positive. And yes, you could argue, well, maybe people should take the long-term calculations into effect. That's not really the way that public opinion works. It's certainly not the way that politics works.
I suppose Rishi Sunak is one of the few politicians in the country people can actually name. Most people couldn't name more than a handful of members of the cabinet, and probably only a few could actually name the leader of the opposition as well. When it comes to these big names in politics, these big beasts, these people that actually cut through, does that tend to affect how people view parties and the overall voting intentions as well?
That's a really good question, and you're right that the average person in the street, and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street, isn't paying much attention to politics, and certainly not most of the, shall we say, more minor names in politics. And so people know who the Prime Minister is, but beyond that, actually, you'd probably be surprised at the lack of name recognition that a lot of people get. But there's no doubt that particularly the leaders and also the other senior figures within a party, most notably the Chancellor or the Shadow Chancellor, do inform what people think about a party, whether they think they can trust it, whether they think it can be effective, whether they think it can do right by them. Those sort of grand narratives, they're very much led by how people perceive the leader.
And looking at the leadership prospects of the Conservative Party, has Rishi Sunak potentially missed a trick? If 2 months ago he would have decided to walk out of the cabinet, resign over Partygate, that would probably have forced the falling of Boris Johnson. There'd probably be a leadership contest, and Rishi Sunak could well be Prime Minister today. Has he missed his chance?
I think that is very unlikely to have ever happened. 2 months ago, his wife would still have been receiving more than £11 million, if reports to be believed, in dividends every year. 2 months ago, his wife would still have been paying £30,000 to secure her non-dom status, even though the average UK disposable household income is only £31,000 a year. Those facts aren't going away. This was always going to be difficult for Rishi Sunak. He has, or at least he had, a lot of things going for him, but it was inevitable down the track that the problems would persist. I think an interesting question is to ask whether 2 years ago he believed his own hype, or whether he thought, actually, I've got all this coming, I'd better get as much done as I can now before the proverbial hits the fan.
It is a remarkable situation. A week is a very long time in politics. It seems like we've been saying this ad nauseum since 2016, really. But what a remarkable time. Joe Twyman, thank you so much for talking us through those really, really, really interesting issues right there. Well, we've seen the horrendous images from Ukraine, haven't we? We've seen the images from Bucha. But do the awful actions taken by Russian troops amount to genocide? We'll be discussing that next. All that to come. But first, it's the latest GB News headlines.
It is 12:34. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. The man who killed Sabina Nessa has been sentenced to life in prison. He must serve at least 36 years behind bars after pleading guilty to her murder. Kochi Selamaj from Easterbourne killed the schoolteacher in a park in southeast London last September as she walked to meet up with friends. During the sentencing, the judge said it was cowardly of Selamaj to refuse to attend, but said he had no power to force him. Ukrainian officials say 39 people have been killed and over 100 wounded in a Russian rocket strike on a railway station in East Ukraine. 2 rockets struck the station in the city of Kramatorsk, which was busy at the time with women, children and elderly evacuees. President Zelensky says Russian forces are cynically destroying the civilian population. The Kremlin denied any involvement in the attack. At least 2 people have been arrested after climate activists staged a protest on Tower Bridge. 2 Extinction Rebellion members were seen hanging from the bridge by suspension cords. They had unfurled a banner that reads, "End fossil fuels now." Police have closed surrounding roads while the incident is ongoing. The musician Dizzy Rascal has been given a community order with a 24-week curfew and a 12-month restraining order for assaulting his ex-fiancée. The grime artist, whose real name is Dylan Mills, was found guilty of attacking Cassandra Jones after a trial in March, with the judge concluding he'd been abusive and aggressive. You're up to date. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Don't go anywhere. Shortly, we'll have a break and then we'll be back with Tom.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, P&O Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Welcome back. Now, a clash of civilizations, war crimes, genocide. These are just a few terms that have been used to describe the current conflict in Ukraine. The definition of genocide has often been contested and resulted in heated arguments as to whether genocides, for example, in the Xinjiang province of China today, should be recognised. Ukraine's become the latest conflict to see the word genocide attributed to it. But are we being too hasty in that assessment? Joining me to explore the difference between genocide and war crimes is Olivia Marks-Waldman, the CEO of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. Welcome to the programme. Thanks so much for coming into the studio. It's an incredibly harrowing sight to see, particularly those images in Bucha outside Kiev, where bodies are strewn across the streets, some with hands tied behind their backs, shot in close quarters. Civilians. Many Ukrainian politicians that I've interviewed on this programme, indeed President Zelensky himself, has used the word genocide to describe some of those Russian actions. Are they right?
Well, of course, you're you're right to highlight all those atrocities that are taking place. And of course, on some level, the words we use aren't significant when we see those atrocities. We have a human response of compassion and an urge to do something to support the Ukrainians. And of course, that's what politically and militarily we're seeing. Where it matters about which word we use is when we come to a court of law and are saying, what can Putin and his regime be charged with? Because there the word genocide takes on a very particular meaning that people might not use when they're just referring to the atrocities that they're seeing in daily language. So I'm not yet convinced that we're seeing evidence of genocide. It does have a very high bar in a court of law, but that shouldn't stop us seeking for Putin to be tried and charged with war crimes and for justice to be pursued relentlessly.
So what is that definition of genocide? Is there something to do with the mechanised nature of it, or is it more intent?
It is definitely that intent to wipe out a people. So not just what happens in the course of a war, but an intent to wipe out a people or a group of people, a community, simply because of who they are. So, of course, I'm here from the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. We commemorate the Holocaust, and we also commemorate genocides that have taken place since. In fact, today, when I leave here, I'm going to a service to commemorate the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. Today is the anniversary when that genocide started. People there were murdered just because they were members of the ethnic group of Tutsi. In the Holocaust, people were attacked because they were Jews. So there is a definition that relates to an attempt to wipe out a group, an attempt to destroy their culture, their language. We know that Hitler wanted to preserve some Jewish artifacts as a commemoration of a lost civilization. He wanted to wipe out the entire culture. So there's that aspect to a genocide as well as the intent.
I hadn't heard that before, that Hitler sort of wanted to almost sort of put this stuff in a museum but not have it. That's remarkable.
Isn't it extraordinary? Because he wanted to show it as this civilization and a culture that he had made extinct. He wanted to wipe out Jewry right across Europe.
And he'd keep those artefacts as almost like a trophy of what he's done in such a
just a few of them, because of course many of them were destroyed
Yes.
in the course of the Holocaust and in the years leading up to the Holocaust.
That's something I'd never heard before. That's a really remarkable aspect of it.
Yes.
When we're looking at what Mr. Putin is doing in Ukraine, there have been some reports in Russian state media of what he terms in this really peculiar through-the-looking-glass way as denazification, where he says that that President Zelensky, who himself, of course, is of Jewish heritage, and the Ukrainian government, and indeed the Ukrainian people, have somehow been Nazified, are somehow Nazis. One report in Russian state media at the start of this month was saying that the Russian army should go through a process of denazifying the country, i.e. wiping out sort of the Ukrainian identity in that way. If that were to be taken forward and displayed in a systematic way, would that contribute as genocide?
Well, the use of his language is worrying and dangerous on very many levels, because he's using it very deliberately to try and justify what he's doing, because Nazis. If we all know how evil Nazis were, so of course he's using this as a rallying cry to try and justify what he's doing. But it is a gross distortion of the far-right situation in Ukraine, which is a very small percentage of the popular vote. So it would be part of what he's doing, the intent behind what he's trying to do in Ukraine, because he is talking about wiping out Ukrainians. For us, using that language has very particular warnings for us, and I think for people who are really listening to what's going on, because distortion of the history of the Holocaust is dangerous, because we need to keep hold of the truth of the past and be alert to the truth of what is happening today. So when it is distorted, that changes the situation. And when it is done deliberately, as Putin is doing, it is deeply anti-Semitic. And to do it against, as you said, Zelensky, whose own family suffered in the Holocaust and who is Jewish, it is even more dangerous. So when we look at the situation, there are all those different aspects to what Putin and his regime are doing that need to be considered as what we hope would happen, which is for Putin to be charged with war crimes and for all these different aspects to be looked at and to see if the bar of genocide might be reached.
But not to pre-conclude that and to explore and collect the data as it is. I'm afraid we've run to the end of this conversation, but thank you so much for coming in and talking through those really important and fascinating issues.
Thank you.
Really, really interesting discussion there. Moving on to our next story. Whilst the UK has led the way out of lockdown, arguably, parts of China now find themselves stuck behind the locked doors again due to the Chinese Communist Party's response to COVID-19. Shanghai, the busiest port in the world, has shut down and containers are beginning to pile up. Interestingly, there's been rare signs of public protest and panic buying has been seen taking place. Well, joining me to discuss what these signs of unrest mean for China and the impact of the closure of Shanghai, that impact that it'll have on global supply chains even. The director of the University of Oxford's China Centre, Professor Rana Mitter, is here. Welcome to the programme. I suppose it is extraordinary to so many of us, where COVID seems like something that is receding into the past. The fact that the people of China are being plunged back into lockdown, indefinite lockdowns as they're being described in some cases. How does China end up in this situation?
Well, Tom, you're right that this is being noticed actually in China itself. One of the memes that's going around on social media is that the current year is not 2022, but in a pun between Chinese and English, they say it's 2020, TOO. In other words, back to 2020 when the world was in lockdown. But the answer is really that the Chinese Communist Party took a decision very early on in the pandemic in February, March of 2020, that they would go for what they call a zero COVID policy. In other words, that no case of COVID could be allowed to basically spread or in any way grow in the wider population. People had to be sent to hospital, isolated, and essentially shut down. And for about a year or so, in some ways, it worked very well. Even though statistics are clearly, how can one put it, put together in a way that's approved by the state, it is clear when one talks to friends in China that the death rate has been very, very low compared to many other countries. But the problem is that the exit strategy is now very unclear. It appears to be basically mostly now about doubling and tripling down on the existing strategy, and social media in China shows that people are getting increasingly concerned that it may never end.
It's extraordinary to see some video out of Shanghai where people seem to have broken out of locked down homes to protest on the streets. Only a small number, I should say, but it's extraordinary that people would have the courage to do so in such a society. Given that zero COVID seems to be very, very hard to push ahead with, in the context of Omicron and super spreadable subvariants of it, has China made a misstep here, and is it potentially fostering some really quite significant dissent?
Well, actually, it's worth noting that the nature of dissent in China is not quite as simple as you put it, Tom, although I know where you're coming from on that. One of the things that we've seen over the years, both in terms of protests on the street and in social media, is that the top-level authorities have generally pushed the blame towards lower-level authorities. So those protests are mostly about local politicians in Shanghai at a kind of provincial level who are now being openly blamed. And in fact, the centre, the Beijing government, is blaming them too. So it's more of a strategy of saying, actually, it was, the government's got it right. The local officials are the ones who have got it wrong in that particular case. If you look at social media, there's also been a long trend in China on lots of subjects, sexist workplaces or, crackdowns on environmental issues, where basically a certain amount of dissent is actually permitted on Weibo, the China's equivalent to Twitter, you might say, partly because it helps the authorities both say that they do allow a certain amount of freedom of speech and also for them to monitor what people are concerned about. But let's be really clear, that only goes up to certain limits. And in this case, I suspect that there is going to be a lot more censorship of people on social media basically complaining about being locked down, about their pets being killed. This is something that's going wild on Chinese social media. Dogs are basic pets are being slaughtered by the health officials on the grounds that they might be carrying COVID. That, and we know we're in Britain, we're in a dog-loving country too, that's making a lot of people very, very angry indeed in China.
I can imagine that. I remember seeing a report of some hamsters being killed in Hong Kong.
That was Hong Kong, yes.
To stop the spread, which is really quite remarkable and bizarre. But it is extraordinary that the Chinese Communist Party seems to be seeking to wash their hands of decisions that the Chinese Communist Party has made by pushing it down to lower levels. I hadn't quite heard that put in that way before. Are they successful in that attempt to blame others?
Well, here's the end game. And I have to say, Tom, naming no names, but some governments around the world do sometimes push the blame for what politicians do onto officials. It's not unknown even outside China, but let's not go down that route. Here's the end game, I think, from the Chinese Communist Party point of view. Number one, there's going to be almost certainly no change in the policy this calendar year. The reason being that Xi Jinping, president of China, general secretary of the Communist Party, is looking for an unprecedented third term in power. Normally, you only get two. And that won't be put into place until probably October at the Chinese Party Congress. So expect relatively little change till then. Then I think the strategy actually is to go, double, triple, quadruple on new vaccines. China has not had mRNA vaccines, ones like Pfizer and Moderna, which and the kind of vaccines it does have are not as good as AstraZeneca, which is the Western equivalent of the other sort of vaccine. But a lot of money, a lot of investment is being put in China's labs to basically get vaccines out. I think 23 are in production, from what I've gathered at the moment. That may be essentially the turning point. Turn China a little bit like the UK into a country that has very wide jabs at all levels, and that may finally be the moment at which the tide turns. But I would expect that if this carries on as it is, we're talking months, not weeks.
Remarkable that they've come to this realisation a little bit too late. A really fascinating issue, and no doubt one that we'll continue to follow with interest. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, Professor Rana Mitter, Director of the University of Oxford's China Centre. Now, Russia-aligned hackers and trolls compromised the social media accounts of dozens of Ukrainian military officers, attempting to upload videos of defeated and surrendering Ukrainian soldiers, before being stopped by Facebook and Instagram's parent company Meta, a new report by the company has revealed. The report detailed a surge in social media disinformation this year, including an increase in content linked to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It also indicated an uptick in domestic disinformation and propaganda in countries around the world, suggesting that tactics pioneered by foreign intelligence agencies are now being used more widely. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Imran Ahmed from the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. Thanks so much for joining us, Imran. I suppose, first of all, it's not particularly new that Russia-aligned hackers have been trying to make their way onto social media. What is potentially new is that Meta, that parent company of Facebook and Instagram, is being quite so forthright in trying to stop them.
Well, you're right. Look, hostile states have been trying to use social media to exact all sorts of things in our societies, whether it is to change election results, it is to seed disinformation, it is even as a weapon that might harm people, which is disinformation, for example, about vaccines. But what we've seen here is Meta trying to be a little bit more transparent. Let's just remember that the war's been going on for quite some time now. The actual primary outlets that have been used to spread disinformation, they are still up and running on most platforms, and that action was taken very late in the game. But there is an attempt to try to get ahead of it. We've seen Facebook evolving recently. In fact, I think in part as a result of Nick Clegg having taken over as global head of communications for Meta.
Is it possible to actually counter all disinformation on social media platforms? Or is a certain level of disinformation just the price that we have to pay for having such incredible technologies that allow people to connect across the world without interference, let or hindrance from governments or companies?
Sure. There's always going to be attempts to spread disinformation. The war in Ukraine, for example, didn't start with tanks or missiles. It started with lies and misinformation deliberately spread via social media, via networks like Russia Today, in order to create confusion and chaos in the narrative over why Russia was invading the Ukraine. But we also know that there are big platforms like Russia Today, like TASS, like Sputnik, like Ruptly, which have been around for a long time, have spread disinformation about the COVID vaccine, which was designed to harm Westerners, not Russians. This isn't Russian language disinformation. This is English language disinformation that they're producing. That it was designed to sow confusion about what's happening in Russia geopolitically, and also things like climate denial. I mean, if there's something bad that you can do, they've been up to it, these channels, on these platforms with absolutely no consequences for a very long time. And so, there's things happening now. I don't think we should go over the top and say Facebook have changed their ways. The reality is that they're trying to quantify for a little bit and, in fact, create excuses for the reasons why Russia has been able to get away with it for so long.
Well, in our final 30 seconds of this conversation, and indeed the programme, what can individuals do when they spot something they suspect to be Russian disinformation? What can we as viewers do to try and counter that?
It's really simple. Don't touch it. Don't engage with it. Don't retweet it to say, look at this rubbish. Don't send it to anyone. Go and find some good information from a credible, well-researched source and spread that instead. That way you outweigh the amount of engagement that we give to bad information, and we give the whip hand to good information.
Interesting there that even those so-called hate shares, the dunking quote tweets, for want of a better term, saying this stuff is awful, that gives it a lot more power than it otherwise might have had. Really interesting there. Well, Imran Ahmed from the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, thank you for talking us through those issues there. We've come to the end of the show. You've been watching The Briefing. Up next, it's Liam Halligan, and he's on the money.
Hello, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update from the Met Office. The weekend will be fine and dry for most, and that's what we've got today. It's still pretty cold out there, however. The wind's perhaps not quite as strong as the past couple of days. And it's not dry and fine everywhere. This area of low pressure has been scooting its way up through the channel, bringing some wet conditions along the south coast. Certainly a pretty grim day across the Channel Isles, wet and at times quite windy here. But that rain is edging away from the south coast. Many places dry and bright. We still have a cold wind blowing, particularly across the northeast, where we'll see some sleet showers, some snow over the hills. A few rain showers developing across southern England this afternoon as that wetter weather clears away. And for many, as I said, it's dry and it's bright. Temperatures below average for the time of year, still feeling pretty chilly, but out of the breeze, we might get up to 13 Celsius in the south. That wind, though, is still strong and still cold across the northeast. Still further snow showers over the high ground here into low levels. Showers could mean some icy conditions as well. The potential for a few showers across the southeast during the evening and overnight, but for many it becomes dry and clear, and temperatures certainly across northern Britain, much of Wales will drop in rural areas down below freezing. So again, it could be icy across northeast Scotland as the showers keep coming in here on Saturday. A few showers dotted around elsewhere, parts of Wales and particularly northwest Scotland's turning a little wetter through the day. But for the vast majority, it's another dry, bright day with some good spells of sunshine, but it is still on the chilly side with temperatures struggling to get much beyond double figures, maybe 13 across the south. But again, those winds are lighter than they have been over recent days. Light winds and clear skies will allow frost to form for many as we head through Saturday night and into Sunday. Still some wet weather across Scotland, still some sleet and snow mixed in here. For many, Sunday starts with a frost, but again dry and bright, although it will cloud over in the west later. Maybe a few spots of rain for Northern Ireland. Signs of things getting warmer next week.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis